Right, folks, welcome to another LIDNUG live presentation. Hopefully this is going to work okay. We do have a few technical problems, so apologies in advance if anything goes wrong tonight. We're using a new version of Live Meeting, and after last night with the Scott Guthrie session and with this one, it's proven to be a little bit unstable. Hopefully we'll get through the next 90 minutes and we won't have too much of a problem. Thanks to our main sponsors. Winterlect should also be on there. I'm using an old slide deck, so some of the details on here are incorrect. But without our sponsors, we couldn't make any of this happen. We couldn't put these sessions on each week for you all in any way, shape or form. If you want to drop us an email, you can get us at info@lidnug.org. You can find us on twitter.com/lidnug, facebook.com/lidnug, and our archives, that is all these sessions that we record, are available on youtube.com on LIDNUG. Ignore that, that's in the past. Ignore that, that's not who's speaking tonight. And you can ignore that one as well because that's from an old slide deck. So we'll just go back to that page there, and I'll bring this page up here, and I will tell you that tonight we have ASP.NET we have WinForms for web forms. So, right, we'll try that again. Sorry, I'm trying to mute people at the same time. We have ASP.NET MVC for web form developers. So if you're still stuck firmly in the trenches of writing and maintaining a web forms application and you want to know what MVC is all about, particularly the new versions, then you need to speak to our friend who's sitting here in the wings called Walt Ritscher from Winterlect. And at that point, I'll let you have the floor, Walt.
Well, thank you very much. You had me a little worried there when you were saying WinForms. I was going to have to do a different talk. But I actually do a number of UX technologies. Thanks for the welcome, everyone. Good to see you. We have a nice list of people here. I'm assuming all of you are web form developers or current ASP.NET developers. As Peter said, we've been having some technical issues. My microphone's been disconnected several times while we've been waiting. Apparently there's something buggy about the new audio stack in Live Meeting. So if I get disconnected, what I'm going to have to do is log off and log back on. Let me share my desktop. And we'll get my PowerPoint up. So, as I was introduced, my name is Walt Ritscher. You can get a hold of me at this Wintelect email address, waltr@wintelect.com. And I'm also on Twitter at Walt Ritscher. My background is in UX and UI design, what we'd probably call presentation layer nowadays. So I've been in .NET since the early times, and I've worked in WinForms, WebForms, ASP. I've worked in ASP Classic. I'm doing XAML. So anything that has to do with drawing pixels on the screen, presenting data, and gathering information from the users, that's where I like to live. And so I've been fascinated by both the web technologies that Microsoft has and the Windows technologies. So the agenda for today is we're going to be comparing MVC and web forms. We'll be looking at what the common pieces are, what some people at Microsoft call the one ASP.NET ideals. After that, we'll talk briefly about routes, what they are and how they enable clean URLs in your users' browsers. We'll talk about the first piece of MVC, which is the controller. The controller is the first place that you put your code in your ASP.NET MVC application, and we'll in particular look at the methods that live inside that controller called action methods. After that, we'll look at rendering of HTML using views. And if you're going to write a view, you need to mix together HTML and code. In this case, I'll be doing C# code. And the view engine that you're going to use for that, or the one I'm using today, is called Razor. And so we'll look at Razor syntax, and we'll also talk about this concept of Razor templates. And we'll look at sharing UI with MVC layouts. If you've worked with master pages in web forms, it's kind of the same idea. If you have parts of your UI that you want to reuse across multiple views, then you can put them in a shared layout and then reference that. We'll look at how to generate HTML using something called an HTML helper. These are extension methods that are responsible for taking some information in and outputting a small chunk of HTML. And then we'll look at model binding, which is a way of getting data into your action methods inside your controller. And then the final topic will be input validation. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time on each one of these topics. We only have an hour and 15 minutes today, so we're going to briefly go over.
A second there.
Yes.
Michael wants to know if you can bring your resolution down a little bit.
Down further. I think I can do that. It's going to make things harder to see in Visual Studio. Go with this one. Now that one, I'll go.
Just take it down as far as is comfortable, Walt, if you can.
Sure, it's a trade-off, right? The smaller I make my screen, the less you can see in tools like Visual Studio. All right, that should be a little better. Now, we're taking a high-level look at MVC today. As I mentioned, I work for Winelect. I teach some of their classes, and we have a 5-day version of this course at ASP.NET MVC, which contains 26 modules, and it includes about 8 hours of hands-on labs. So if you're interested in something like that, you can go to our Winelect page, winelect.com, and find out how to get live training. Winelect also participates in the online video training market through something called Winelect Now, and you can see hundreds of courses there, including some of the material from today's presentation. And you can get a free trial for Winelect Now. If you go to Winelect Now and use this sign-up code RIT-trial, you can sign up for, I think it's a 14-day free trial, and you're free to share this code with your friends and coworkers. Try it out, see what you think. Let's talk about ASP.NET MVC. So ASP.NET, as you probably know, if you're a web form developer, has been a huge success. There's lots of sites built with it, and I work with companies from 2-people companies up to multinational companies, and a lot of them use ASP.NET. But we all know that nothing stays static in our software development world, and best practices change over time. And over the years, web developers have come up with new traditions, and tools like Ruby on Rails have grown quite popular. And tools like the new JavaScript improvements, HTML5, they cause us to rethink some of our best practices. And so Microsoft made a decision a few years back that MVC pattern in web development was very popular, and that web forms was starting to reach some issues with dealing with some of the new things like HTML5. So they decided to modify ASP.NET to work with the MVC pattern. But one of the key decisions that they made, I think was a good decision on their behalf, was not to abandon the web form people, not to just completely cut you off. So they came up with this term, I think it was coined by Scott Hanselman, called One ASP.NET. The idea is if you're a web developer and you've decided to build on top of the Microsoft stack, then you're going to pick ASP.NET. And then you're going to build your ASP.NET from parts that make sense, that are part of the ASP.NET ecosystem. And here's a diagram you may have seen on the internet for one ASP.NET. The blue areas represent the two areas that we can build code. We can build sites, which are generating HTML usually and showing UI to the user, and we can have services, which is code that's called by other applications. So in the site side, we've got MVC. You can see here we've got web pages and web forms and single page applications. In the services area, we've got Web API and SignalR. Right, and they're all built on top of this common layer down here at the bottom. All right, so the key point I want to take here is if you're building a presentation layer that you want to show to your users and you want to optimize it so it's shown inside a web browser or other user agents, then and you think that some of your content is going to be dynamically generated, and you prefer that that dynamically generated code runs on the server, because obviously nowadays we have lots of JavaScript libraries where you can run that code or similar code on the client, then we have two architectural approaches. We can do web forms and we can do MVC. Now, both MVC and web forms share some things. Both of them use the same underlying IIS system. Now, I have to say that some of this is changing. In the next version of ASP.NET, which is based a lot on MVC, what Microsoft is calling ASP.NET, they're calling it ASP.NET vNext. They're changing a lot of the underlying pieces. So you'll be able to self-host and not have to use IIS. But for MVC5, which is what I'm talking about today, this is true. So both of them use the same IIS systems. Both of them use the same ASP.NET pipeline. If you understand HTTP modules and HTTP handlers, those work the same. They're all based on managed code. They are mixtures. When you're building the presentation layer, you're building a mixture of code and markup. They are designed to produce dynamic content. Typically, this is HTML content. And they have access to the entire, pretty much the entire .NET ecosystem. So things like Entity Framework, the async libraries, working with tasks, localization, and all the other things that you typically use in web forms, you can also use in MVC. Another key point that Microsoft made is that you can coexist MVC and web forms in the same project. So if you already got web forms, you've built an application, you're using web forms, you can go ahead and add the MVC portion, start building some controllers, start building some views, and they should work together. Now, there are some caveats, of course, and we don't have time to discuss them in today's 1-hour session, but they can coexist. Now, if you're coming from web forms, there's some things that you're not going to get, right? There's no controls. If you're used to the HTML controls or the web controls, those do not exist in MVC. In Visual Studio, there's no drag and drop designer for creating your UI. You can't go to a toolbox and grab a button and drag it over and drop it on a designer surface. There is no view state. So the fact that when a user types something in a text box and it gets submitted back to the server, and when that text box is shown back in the browser, in web forms you don't have to do any code to make sure that that value is preserved and sent back to the client. So if you like view state for both forms and controls, you're not going to get that in MVC. Same thing with Autopostback. The post back to the server by clicking on a button or selecting an item in a list box. That goes away in MVC. Now, of course, you can still do this, but you might have put some JavaScript on the page instead. And the whole concept of event handlers goes away, at least as far as the forms go. Things like global ASAX, application level events are still there, like application start. But the types of event handlers you have where you've got a text box and you've got a text changed event, we don't have those anymore. You're going to have to submit back to the server and run some code in your views or in your controllers. Let's talk about some of the benefits of MVC. One is extensibility. So the way MVC apps are created is they're composed from separate components. Now, Microsoft typically implements these as interfaces, like iController, or an abstract class in the framework, like, say, the controller class. And I've given some examples here, the way routing works, the way the controllers work, the way the view engines work. And when you're working with a controller or a view engine, there's three ways to work with each of these components. You can accept the default implementation, which Microsoft has tuned for what they call convention over configuration. And that just works out of the box usually. You can also take what Microsoft has implemented and subclass it. You can implement your own base class off their interface, or you can derive off one of their abstract classes, and then you can take that component and tweak its behavior, or you can replace the component with a completely new implementation. That means it's easy to get started with the default settings, but it's completely customizable. If you don't like the way the routing engine works for some scenario in your corporation, then you can go ahead and swap it out with your own implementation. Another benefit is you have type control over your HTML and your HTTP. So you have full control over the HTML output that is coming out of your view. Little of that is hidden. You know, when you're working with something like a text box in Webforms, it's really a control, and the control internally is generating the HTML that is eventually sent to the browser. Here in View, there are no controls, so you are responsible for putting the HTML on the page. And then for HTTP, you have total control over handling of the HTTP requests. So you have to understand, that means you have to understand more things like HTTP verbs, like what's a get and a post and so on. It's completely testable. The Microsoft MVC team has been agile and test-driven for many years, which means that they think about testability and they tend to factor it into their framework. So it's easy to unit test your controllers. And there are templates built into Visual Studio for MVC-specific unit tests that ship with Visual Studio 2012 and later. It fully supports mocking. Microsoft has made sure that most of their functionality is placed in abstract classes so that you can mock up those classes if necessary. And they also have a UI automation tool that allows you to create test scripts to simulate user interaction. There's a number of ASP.NET versions out there. I'm going to be working with the 5.1 stuff today. To me, the most usable version started. The first really usable version for MVC came in 2011 when Microsoft released MVC 3. I'm going to be using Visual Studio 2013 today, but I think every bit of code that I demonstrate today could also be done in 2012. Now, there are lots of sites built with MVC. ASP.NET itself is very popular. I already mentioned the web forums. There's over 1 million public sites created with MVC, according to this site called builtwith.com. So some of the example sites that you may have seen on the internet, Stack Overflow is an MVC site. This is Ruth's Chris Steakhouse website is built using it. Here's one called MarketWatch, and another one, Kelly Blue Book, are written based on the MVC framework. Before I talk any more details about MVC and how it works, I'd like to show a little bit of code. I'm going to switch over to my Visual Studio, and we're going to start by looking at a new project. All right, so I'm going to be working with the 4.5 framework. I'm going to be working with web. I'm going to choose the Visual C# web template. When you create an application, there's only one choice in here. This is the idea of a one ASP.NET. You basically say, I'm going to build an ASP.NET application. And then you click OK. And then in this next screen, you're given a choice of what building blocks you want to include in your MVC project. So I can choose empty, which means I basically get a really basic shell. If I choose web forms, then I'm going to get all of the assemblies necessary and the NuGet packages necessary for working with web forms. But here's the key part, right? Is you can come down here and add other references for MVC to that web forms project. If you primarily want it to be an MVC application, but you want to support web forms, then you would click here. Okay. And then we also have web API and the other application types here. So I'm going to choose this middle one here, MVC. And then I'm not going to add any unit tests, but that's a possibility. I can also choose what kind of authentication to set up for this. Individual user account, organizational accounts, Windows authentication. I'll turn off authentication for this demo. And then you can also choose whether you want to host this in the cloud. So if I say host this in the cloud, then I'm going to have to log into my Azure portal. I have to give it my credentials, right? Sign in as Walt Ritscher, and then I will be able to push my content to Azure as necessary. I'm not going to do that for today, so I'll uncheck that, and then click OK. Okay. So some things will be familiar when you look in this Solution for Explorer. For instance, you'll see that there's a global ASAX here, and if you look in the global ASAX, you'll see that it has a application_start method, which is using the same naming conventions that you get in web forms. You'll see that we're doing some things in here. We're registering something called bundles, and we're registering something called routes, and we're registering global filters. The only one of these we're going to look at today is this line 14, how you register routes. Okay. You'll see we have something like the fave icon is in there, and we have a web config file in the root of the website. Okay. But things start getting different when you look at the rest of the structure. You've got an app_start folder. This is where all of your configuration files go. So the one that we're going to be working with today is this route config. This is where you set up your routes to get you to your controllers. I'll talk more about this in about 10 minutes. Okay, so this is being called by global.asx. The next thing in MVC to understand is that it uses a convention over configuration approach. So Microsoft assumes that you're going to keep your controllers in this folder. Now you can put them elsewhere. It's changeable. But by default, they create a controllers folder. And in this example, they added a single controller to this project. It's called the home controller. Okay. This controller derives from the controller base class. It has a naming convention where the ending the name is the word controller. So if you have a shipping controller, it would be called shipping controller, and it would derive off the controller base class. There's also an interface that you can implement, iController, but it's easier to use the controller base class. And then you create a number of methods in here. These are your action methods. More about that in a few minutes. Okay, so we have a standard controllers folder. We also have a models folder, which has no models in it. Personally, I think that most of your models are going to go in a business layer. You're probably going to have a separate DLL that has your business logic in it, and you would just reference that instead of keeping those models here. You're obviously going to have some JavaScript, so there's a scripts folder. This is not any different than what you have in web forms. Some of the libraries may be different than you have in web forms, but the idea is that you have all your JavaScript files in a single folder. And then you're also going to have a views folder. Now, this is where you keep your views. Views are where you generate your HTML usually. And you'll see that there is a couple things inside this views folder. There's a web config file. This is configuration settings that are specific for MVC and the views. And then there is a couple of special files in here we'll talk about later. There's an _viewstart.cshtml file, and then there is a folder. Typically what you do is you have one folder for each controller. So if I have the home controller, I'm going to have the home folder. And there's also a shared folder, and this is where you keep the common HTML. So like master pages and web forms, you put your common code here, and then you basically wrap your views inside the common HTML. So the main tool here is this one here called _layout.cshtml. Okay. Now this application will work. There's only one controller, right? If I run this application in a browser, I'm going to be using Google Chrome today. Up comes the browser. And here is the default view template that Microsoft has created. Right, so the home page has some text on it, and things like this title bar and the footer, those are coming from the shared code, the shared templates. Okay, so let's take a brief look at all of the working parts of MVC before we go back to Visual Studio. So let's look at the working parts here. In this example, the user has requested a URL on our domain. The end of the URL is tours/blank. The routing module is the first step in our MVC application. It parses that URL and attempts to match it to a route. That route then determines which controller to instantiate. The routing module also determines which action method to call in the controller. The controller is a class, and all the public methods that are in that class are considered to be action methods. Okay. Now, each action method is responsible for returning a response to the client. How this is accomplished is up to you and your code. There are many types of responses available. For example, you can tell the client to redirect to another website or redirect to another controller within your application. Another possibility is to return an HTTP status code to the client browser. But in general, the most common response is to return dynamic HTML. The HTML is generated on the server and then sent back to the browser. When you decide to return HTML, your action method will probably collaborate with other MVC parts. For example, you probably want to instantiate a business model. So over here I have a business model, and inside my action method I would instantiate my business model and pull some of my data from my repository or my data layer or however I'm going to get the data. And then I also need a view. So I need to tell MVC where the view is. And that's where I'm going to generate my HTML. So a common pattern in MVC is within the action method is to choose and open one or more models, next craft a subset of the model data and load it into a view model, and then send that view model over to the view. Right? So think about the controller as the controlling thing, right? It's deciding what models to create, it's deciding what views to open, and it's deciding what data out of the model data that it got, what is the important pieces of data to send over to the view. Okay. Now what about the view? For the moment, think of the view as a dynamic HTML generator. You create a view template that contains HTML and code. The default code engine in MVC is called Razor. There are others, but that's the most common one and the one I'm going to use today. Each code engine has rules about file names and locations. Right? For example, the Razor view engine assumes that your template files, if you're using C#, are going to end with the .cs HTML extension. Okay. Razor also has a syntax rules that indicate how to switch from HTML to code in the Razor template. So here you can see I've got some HTML and some code. So the way you write HTML is it looks just like HTML, and then you switch over to code by using a special symbol, in this case the @ symbol. And the @ symbol says I'm calling the datetime class and I'm working with its now member. Right. Now what kind of code can you, what about the code that's living in this view? Well, you can choose between C# or VB code. You have a lot of flexibility in the kind of code that you write. The most important task is to consume the data passed in from the action method and construct the appropriate HTML. So you have access to this data and can use it, also can use most of the .NET libraries. Now I recommend that you be judicious about what code is placed in the view. Most of the code that you write or use in MVC lives in your models and your controllers. Just because you have access to the query string in the view does not mean that it's the best place to do so. I prefer to put that kind of code in my controller. You can write for loops, and you can write if-then statements inside your view, but that typically is not the best use of where to put that code. There are also MVC-specific helpers available within the view template. These are known as HTML helpers, and their purpose is to generate HTML or text. So typically what you do is you pass information into the helper method, and it produces the requested HTML output. So in this example, I'm using the listbox4 helper method. This is an extension method. And I'm using that to create some HTML to generate a list box in the browser. I'm also using the display4 helper and to create some display UI for one of my business entities. Now remember that my business data was passed in from my controller, and that's what this lambda expression here is doing. It's saying I know that I was passed in a model, right? And I'm looking for a property on the model called product name. I want you to retrieve that, and I want you to then wrap that in some HTML tags that make it a read-only display. Right. This is about as close as you get to controls in MVC. Okay. Next, we'll look at model binding. Each action method in the controller, here's my action method inside my controller, can have parameters. So MVC can automatically gather information from the HTTP request and assign it to the action method parameters. That's done through the model binding engine. So in this example, I have an action method that takes an int parameter named product ID. The model binder is invoked before the action method is called. It determines that the method has a parameter, and the parameter's name is product ID. It examines the incoming request to see if it can find any data with a matching name. So it's going to look in my HTTP headers for something called product ID. It's going to look in my HTML form fields. It'll examine the query string. It'll look at route parameters. It can look inside cookies. Right? Now, there's an order of precedence from this. Right? It examines one of these, and if it doesn't find something with that name on it, then it moves to the next one. Right? And if it finds something called product ID, then it looks at the data type, in this case an int, and determines whether the piece of data that's stored inside that cookie, let's say, can be converted to an integer. It verifies that the data can be cast to an int type and then populates the method parameter with that data. Okay. So let's take this example here. I have a value of 127 coming in. There's an input box in the HTML form called product ID. The user has typed the number 127, and they've clicked on the submit button. So that item will get placed inside product ID. Right, and then, of course, I'm going to use that when I go to my business model and use that to retrieve the record that I need, and then I'm going to format that data and send it over to my view. Model binding also handles validation of input data. Now, there are many variations of the validation tools. Here I'm looking at the one that works with .NET data annotations. So after the model binder gets the information from the web request, it checks to see if validation is active. By default, model binding validation is enabled and is configured to use data annotations validation providers. Okay. So the model binder examines the underlying business model. It looks in here in my business model to see if there's any data annotations in there. Right? If so, it looks to see if there's an annotation that applies to the product ID. Right. In my example, let's assume that there's an annotation that forbids negative numbers in the product ID. So if a negative number is found in the inbound data, the model binder sets the model state.isValid property defaults. So I can check that in the body of my action method to find out whether it's okay to invoke the view or whether I need to requery the user for data. If the data is a positive number, then the model state.isValid property is set to true, and I'll find that out in my code, and then I'll go ahead and invoke my view. Okay. The final piece of the puzzle is support for client-side validation. So MVC projects can inject validation script into the HTML document. Then you can use the HTML helper methods to construct your form UI. Now remember I said there's no web forms, but obviously there's still HTML forms in our views. So we're going to create an HTML form. We're going to use the HTML helper classes. Like I'm going to create an editor here that's going to show the age property from my business model. And I'm also going to put a validation message in my view, and I'm going to say monitor age. So what's going to happen now is when I put a negative value in for the age property, the validation engine is going to see that. It's going to inject some JavaScript into my HTML document, and then it's going to turn on an error UI. Now, again, if you've done web forms and you've used the some of the error provider, the validation controls that are part of web forms, this is a similar idea. You know how they inject JavaScript too. Okay, so that's it for the basic concepts. Are there any questions on that before we move on?
Come on, guys. Anybody want to put anything into the Q&A tab? If you've got any questions based on that first segment, please feel free to just enter them in the Q&A and we'll deal with them as we go.
And if there are no questions, I'm going to go to demos for the rest of our time. This is a Visual Studio solution that has several projects in it. I'm going to start by looking at this route demo project. So I'll make that my startup project. And we'll go over here and look at global.asx. And when my application starts up, it's calling this method here, register routes. Okay. Now, if there are no routes available, right, there's no way to get to any of our controllers or any of our web forms unless we invoke them directly. So notice in this application, I do not have a default.html or I don't have a default.aspx. I do have something called tours.aspx and products.aspx in this file. So I'm going to go ahead and comment out this code here. Make sure I have the right project open. Go back here. I'm going to comment out this route registration, and I'm going to run the application. And I get a 403 in this case. So I have no default.aspx in this application, but I do have one called products.aspx. So I can go directly to that. I can see my products page. Now I can also set up a route. Let's say that I want to have a route that says, well, something when I type in the word bargains here, I want to go to that products page. Right. So what it'll do is I'll go back to my global.asx file and I will uncomment this line. And then we'll go look at the code that's over here. Press F12 to go over to that method. So you can see right here I'm registering a route with the routing engine that says if the user types the word shop or the words bargain, you see I've got two different routes in here. If they type the word shop, I want you to go to this physical file. It shows that routing also works with web forms. Okay? If you type in this URL, take me to the tours.aspx page. And if you type in the word bargains, take me to the sale page. And take me to the sale controller. So you can see I've got maps to pages and I've got maps to controllers in here. Right? So let's run this one again. I'm going to use the word shop to get to the products page. I can go directly to there. It's using this route, or I can still use products.aspx. Okay. Now this is an MVC session, so we're going to more concentrate on what you do with MVC. In MVC, we need to route to a controller and an action method. So over in my project, I currently have a controller. I have several controllers. I have a home controller with a method called index, and I have a sale controller with a method called index, and I have a cities controller with a method called list cities. All right. So I'm going to set up a route. More screen real estate there. Here's a MVC route. You can give your routes names. It's not important for what we're seeing today. The key part here is the URL that we're going to go to, and this one's going to instantiate the controller called sale, and it's going to call the index method. Yeah. Now I've hard-coded. I have one URL that maps to one index method inside one controller. In the real world, you probably want to put some placeholders in there so I can have one route that goes to multiple spots. And so that's what this third example shows. This is the default MVC route here. And what this is showing is these placeholders that you can put inside your URL. So this says, examine the URL. If there's a piece of text followed by /, then anything in front of that / is considered to be the controller name. Okay? Anything after that / is considered to be the action name. And if there's another / in there, anything after that second / is considered to be the ID. Okay? And then I can specify a default value. So if the user provides the controller, we'll go to the specified controller. If they don't provide it, then we go to the home controller. Okay. If they don't specify an action, we go to the index method. Otherwise, we go to the specified action. And then this one's marked as optional. Right? So if the user does not provide it, we don't have an error in our route. This is typically something you'd put on the end of your URL to use for, say, like an ID value to retrieve a record from your data sources. Okay, so I'm going to show you the cities controller. I'm going to go to this list cities. So see, when I typed in cities, that's the name of my controller. That's the name of the method I want to go to. The routing engine took me there. Now, there is no index method inside the cities controller class. If I try to go here, it can't find it. So I specified the index method. Right? The MVC framework can't find it, so it can't invoke it. I get a 404 error. On the other hand, if I go to the home controller, it does have an index method, and so it works. Okay. So once we get routed to the controller, then the next thing we have to decide, remember, is what are we going to return back to the browser, the user agent. So for that demo, we're going to look over here in this controllers and action methods project. Right. And we'll go over here and I'll close all these. So this global.asx is registering my routes. If I look in my route table, you see I only have 2 routes. The only one that's important for today's demonstration is this one here. That's the same one you just saw. So we're using the home index and the controller action ID routing system. And then in my controllers folder, I'm going to create several controls. I have a home controller, I have a live demo controller, and I have a results controller. Okay, so if I go to my live demo controller, I write a method called getText, and I return a string. So okay, so I'm returning some text from this method. This is a public method. It lives inside my public live demo controller. So I'm going to go to the live demo, and then I'm going to go to get text, and my request flowed into my MVC application. It found my controller action method. It returned a string. If you right-click on this and look at the source, you'll see that it's just a string. There's no HTML in there. Okay. Now you'll notice that the one up here, that one that Microsoft wrote for me through their templates, it doesn't return a string. It returns I've got two questions. Sorry, I started looking at the question list. So we have two. So Bashad asked a question, can you tell model binding engine only use, for example, query strings? Well, not at the default implementation, you can't. But there is an order of precedence, and if you understand the order of precedence, it's easy to work with. And then Asit asked a question, is there a yardstick to determine which way to go, MVC or web forms? That's a great question, and it's a complicated answer. I'd have to understand more about your company and your projects. If you're building web forms and you've got a lot of money invested in your web forms and a lot of infrastructure built around it, I believe that there's nothing wrong with keep doing web forms, maintaining what you have, and then building new parts of your website with MVC. There's a big learning curve. I mean, you still have to learn about all the MVC pieces. So it's not a free lunch by moving to MVC. If you're picking a new project, I think you'd probably be better served with MVC in the long run. I mean, that seems to be the way things are going in the future. Excuse me. So I would look at that. Okay, so back to what I was showing you here. Now, I returned a string. You can also return a void. You can return an int, whatever you want. But what we really should do is return, what we're supposed to be doing is sending information back to the browser. And so what we can do instead is return something called an action result. Right? And an action result is basically a wrapper around what we want to send back. This is a class that Microsoft wrote. Okay, called action result, and there are a bunch of derived classes off this. So if I plan on returning text, I shouldn't have returned it this way. What I should have done is said I want to do return something called a. Excuse me, just a second. I'm just getting over a cold. Okay, so if I plan on returning text, it's better to return a content result. And now instead of returning a string, I can return, there's a couple ways I can return this. I can say I want to return content. But now there's some properties on the content result class where I can modify the kind of text I'm returning. Now not only can I return the content, but I can also specify the content type and the content encoding. And then when I write my unit tests, right, when I test my controller, I can verify that I'm getting back a content result. Right? Because think about what you could be returning. Sometimes you want to return content. Sometimes you want to return a status code. What if you're trying to return a view and the view isn't there on the server? or they ask for the wrong thing. And so you want to return an error code, right? So in this case, there's two possible things you could return from your method. You could return the error code, or you could return the view. Okay. In that case, I can write a unit test that verifies whether I'm returning a content or a view result, or I'm returning a HTTP status code result. Okay, it makes my code more testable. Okay, so you see what Microsoft did up here is they're returning a view, and that will then invoke my view template. Okay, so rather than writing more code, let's go over and look at this class over here, results controller. So this shows the different kinds of things you can return. Here I'm returning a content. Right? Here I'm returning a content result, and I'm specifying the content encoding, and the content type. I'm saying that this is a CSS file, and you notice that the content I wrote is a little bit of CSS. Here's one where I'm returning content, and I'm encoding it as UTF-7 when I return it. So there's that content's returning the CSS. Okay. This is one that's returning a status code. So here I've got this one called status code A that returns a status code result. Okay. And I can return different status codes by depending on what I type on the URL. So right now I'm returning a 404 error. Let's return a 406. Return a 502. And so I can send the correct status codes back to the browser. I can also specifically return things like an HTTP not found result or an HTTP unauthorized result, and I can also modify the messages that are sent back when I send these status codes back. So I've got a couple of custom strings in here. So this one says, we searched the basement and cannot find that file. This one says, sorry buddy, and so on. Okay. Let's say I have a file that I want to return. So here I'm going to return something called a file result. Right, so now it knows it's sending back a file as opposed to content. And I'm using this file helper method. Now these methods that we're seeing here, things like content, these are actually properties, I'm sorry, members on the controller base class. So here I'm saying call file, and then I'm specifying the name of the file on the server and what type of content's inside that file. When I click on this one, it'll return an XML file to the browser. And here's two actions that return redirects. This first one is going to redirect the user to Microsoft.com. The second one is going to redirect the user to some action that's inside the same controller. Now, if I had Fiddler open and I was watching the traffic, you would have seen the request flowed into the site, and then a redirect request was sent back to the browser, and then the browser requested this Microsoft page. This one's going to redirect back to the XML file action. And finally, you can return JSON. So here's an example where I'm creating an instance of a class that I wrote. I have a cut printer class, and I'm setting a property, 3 properties, printer name is color and page count. And then I'm returning JSON, and I'm saying here's the instance of the class to return and to allow a GET request for this on the server. And then when I get back is a little JSON package. Okay. Now, finally, of course, we're going to want to start returning HTML. Now, I could create a method in here that returned text, and I can handwrite all the HTML in here, but that would be tedious, and it would be hard to test. We were just returning HTML strings. so on. Do you really want to write code like this, create a string and return 200 lines of HTML inside of the string? No, we don't want to do that. So instead what we'll do is we'll use a view template to create this. So the idea is that you will return a view result or a partial view of the result, and then you're somehow going to have to go over and find the correct Razor template to run. Okay, for this demo, I'm going to go to this project here, View Templates. Okay. Again, I have the same route set up. We've already seen. Same route we've already seen. I have two controllers I'm interested in. This is the Razor syntax controller, and it has a method called basic template. Notice that it returns an action result, and I'm calling this view helper method as part of the controller base class. Basically, this tells the view engine, go find a file called basic template that's in a folder called Razor syntax. So if you go look in my views folder down here, you'll see that there is a Razor syntax. This is that convention over configuration. It's assuming that it's going to live in this folder with the name of the controller without the word controller on it. So it's called Razor syntax or pass data. And then inside there is a CSHTML file called basic template. And it's inside here where I write my mixture of HTML and C#. Okay. Now, for you for you Webform developers, if you started in the early days of Webforms, you probably remember that we wrote a lot of mixed code inside our ASPX pages. We used to write some HTML and a little bit of code, and the whole control model changed everything. We stopped doing that mostly, and instead would use controls on our ASPX pages. Well, this is a similar idea, right? So here I have, you see I've defined a style. I have some HTML. I have some paragraph tags in here, some div tags, and then at this point I want to switch over and inject, I want to run some code, and that code is going to go out and get or generate some HTML. So basically I'm saying here, go find the date time class and call this now member, and then format it to a short date time string. Now look at the syntax on this. You get IntelliSense inside Visual Studio. I don't need the semicolon. Right? It knows that this is the last line of code here. So if I actually put that semicolon in there, it'll show up as a semicolon on my web page. It knows when I switched. So now when I type an angle bracket here, it knows I'm in HTML editor mode. So I want to put an unordered list in there. It knows that. Now as soon as I hit the @ symbol, it knows I'm back in the code view. So it's smart about that. Let's look at some of the rest of my code down here. Here I'm saying go use the system.globalization.culture info object and get the current culture, and now put that on the page. And then here's a comment, and then this is a block of code. So I start by putting an @ and a curly brace and then a closed curly brace, and then I'm going to define some code here. So I'm defining a variable called counter. I'm incrementing the counter. I'm incrementing the counter again. I'm using some of the low-level stuff. This is not recommended. I'm using response.write to output. This is probably the wrong way of doing it. And another key thing I want you to see here is I declared the variable here, but I'm using it down here. So I went out of my code block, I wrote a div tag, put some text inside my div tag, and then I said get the counter value and put it here. Okay. So here's some basic text. Here's the date from the code, 12/4. Here's the output from the counter. Here's that globalization information. Here's some information from the session ID. And then this last bit shows you how to group data together in a code state expression. See right here, I'm trying to use the counter. Hold on just a second. Just check to make sure my mic's working. My mic's still working? Yep. Okay. I thought I dropped my mic there for a second. So here I'm trying to use that counter object, and I want to add it to the counter object and divide the results by 2. The problem is when I enter this text here, when I get to the space, right, it thinks I've left the coding world and I'm back in the HTML world. Right? So the simple answer is to wrap that in a set of parentheses, and then this entire thing is considered to be an expression. Bazad has a question, can you put namespace declarations in CS/HTML code? Yes, you can. There's 2 ways of doing it. You can go up to the top up here and put a using statement in, like you'd expect. And the other thing you can do is you can put namespaces in for all of your views by going to your web config file. And in this section right here where it says I'm in the razor, you say these are the, I'm assuming I'm going to be using system.web.mvc all the time in every one of my views. So go ahead and assume that that's scoped. All right, so if you want to add your own custom namespace here, just add an extra row to this section in the web config. All right, so let's run the app again. All right, so you see how this one didn't quite work out the way I wanted it to. It had the value of 7, and then I just got the text here. But this value is the correct value that's inside the parentheses. Overall, I think the Razor syntax engine is very well thought out and well done. It's very easy to work with. It just seems to know when you're switching from code to HTML and back and forth. I really like working with it. Okay, now I need to pass data into my view, right? So that's, I'm a believer in putting as much code as you can in the controller and as little as possible in the view. The kind of code that goes into view is the code that's generating the HTML. So you should pass as much data as possible into the view. So there's a couple of ways you can do that. We'll go look at this controller. You can use something called view data. So here the view data is a property that is exposed on the controller class, and it's also available. It's also available inside your view. So here I'm saying, here's a piece of data identified by this string, and this is the value I'm putting in there. And then I can go over to my view and use this. Now, let me show you how easy it is to make a view inside Visual Studio. And then I'll show you how to pass this data over. Say public. So that's my basic action method. It's called live demo. It's inside my pass data controller. I'm going to return a view. Now, if I try to run this right now, there are no views. I don't have a view called live demo. So if I try to get it, I'm going to get an error saying it can't find that. It can't find that view. I'll show you what I mean. That's not really what I wanted. Oh no, it's called pass data, right? Yeah, pass data. That's what I wanted you to see. So the probing engine went out to try and find the CSHTML, or the correct file, and it did all these searches. It looked for something called livedemo.aspx, livedemo.ascx, and so on, and couldn't find any of these files. So finally, when it exhausted its probing path, it gives me back this error. You'll see this a lot when you're developing. It crops up when you're forget to add your view. All right, so one way to make it work is I could go over to this past data folder, and I could right-click over here, and I could say add a new view. I can choose this one, MVC5 view page. Or the way I prefer to do it is to right-click on this method here and say add view. And then it gives me this template, scaffolding tool, the name of my view, whether or not there's an affiliated data model, right? Whether I want to create a partial view, whether I want to use a set of HTML that lives in another file called a layout page. I'm just going to leave it at the default and click OK, click Add. And you'll see now inside the past data folder, there's now this live demo.cshtml file. Right? So over here, I can get access to the view data, something called the view bag, and I can also get strongly typed data passed over. So back to the past data controller. So this is how I set data in the view data. There's also something called the view bag, which I'm going to skip over today because I want to talk about using strongly typed models. So here I've got this model. I have a fish world repository. We run an aquarium store, so I have this method called getFishes, and that returns a list of fish classes, right? So what I can do is when I create my view, this one, I can specify at the top what the data type is for the data that's being passed in from the controller. So I said I'm expecting to get a list of fish. So now what I can do is down here is the key thing to remember is that this says @model. This is declaring the type that I'm going to use. It uses a lowercase m up here. And then down here in the body of my view, I'm going to use the @ symbol. And I'm going to use capital M. That represents the model. So when I do the dot operator, you're going to see properties of the list class, right? So what I did in this code here is I wrote a little for each loop that says get each of the fish inside the model, and then output the fish name and output the fish price, and format that. Okay, so there, it outputted an unordered list for me with the formatted data. Right. Now, another thing that we typically do in MVC is we craft a special class that lives only for passing the data. Think of it as a data transfer object, a DTO, right? And it's called a Viewmodel. So what I could do is create a Viewmodel class. Go here. So here's a class called passDataViewModel. Right, so this, instead of just passing over the fish collection, the list, I'm creating a property on this called IEnumerable. I'm sorry, it's called fishes, and it returns an IEnumerable of fish. And then I also have an isPremiumCustomer, which is a bool. I have a sale date property. I have a title and a header, right? So now I can instantiate that passDataViewModel. I go to my business layer and I get some fishes. I store them in the fishes property. I say this is a premium customer. We're going to have a sale date that starts 4 days from today, and so on. And then I pass in that view model to my view. And then when I create my view, I say that the model is that passDataViewModel. So now when I do my @model down here, I get the fishes property and the header property and the title property and the sales data Right, so I basically picking the data that I need to send over to the view, populating the data, and then have a strongly typed access to it over. Sometimes called a strongly typed view. Adam had a question. It says, looks like MVC looks like it's halfway between classic ASP and web forms. Yeah, it can look like that. You know, it's got a completely different mechanism for the way we invoke the code, right? The code's, we're getting to the view through the controller. And then there's a question about the debugging experience. The debugger works in Visual Studio the same way it does in MVC as it does in web forms. I can put a breakpoint in my, I'm in my view, right? This is just a text file, but I can put a breakpoint here, F9, and then you see I hit my breakpoint on my for each statement here. And I can press F11 to step through my code. I can hover over to get my hover tips. You can use the immediate window. All the tools that you're used to using will just work, including the JavaScript debuggers too. Okay. So when I need to talk about model binding, I want to talk briefly about the idea of shared templates. To do that, I'm going to go over to this layouts demo. Okay. Now look down here in my models. I'm sorry, in my views folder, I have a home page. Here's my index page. This is all that's on my index page. See that? I've got an unordered list. Something that says managers picks, and an H1 tag up here that says welcome to Neptune's world. This is our aquarium store. Okay. Notice there's no other HTML in here. Okay, but down here I have a view start page. This is inside my views folder, and that says, look, there's a layout page called layout blue neptune.cshtml, and this is the default. So any page that does not specify a shared layout will use layout blue Neptune. And if you look in the shared folder, you'll see there's this CSHTML file here. And this contains my header, my body, a bunch of action links. These are HTML helpers here. And you see right here it says render body. That is a little placeholder that says this is the point at which you need to render the output of the index page, okay, or the photos page, right? So when I run this, right, this is what it looks like. I got my blue Neptune header. I got a nice gradient fill in the background. I got a sidebar. This is the text from the index view. Everything else on the page is coming from that shared layout. Okay. And you see as I move through to the blog page or the photos page or the sale page, right, these are all wrapped in this data. Now, the way we use HTML helpers, let's go take a look at this. Remember I said HTML helpers are these things that output little bits of HTML? So here we go. I'm saying I want you to begin a form. Here's where the form ends. I want you to create an editor for the model. I'm using my fish class as a model. I'm saying I want an editor so the user can type in a new fish name. And I want an editor for the price value. And again, I'm using a lambda expression here to say this is the piece of data from the model. Wrap this in the HTML correctly. Okay. So we go over here, and you see that it output a text box and another text box, and it put a form on there. And then down here, I also put an input type equals submit down there. So when I click on that, it'll send it back to the server, to a postback. Okay. So with model binding, remember the thing I said about model binding is that you can read information, let's say, from the query string or your route. So here I've got a fish. All right, so we're reading this value of 109, and we're using it to get the data and bind these controls. And they're not actually controls, you know what I mean? Okay, so let's look at model binding here. So what I'm saying here is in this CSHTML, I want you to build an editor for the entire model. So look at the fish class and build me an editor for the entire model. Okay, and then over here in my controller class, I say I want to do an action result. I'm going to do a view. I'm going to go get a fish by ID, and here's the key part. See that 107 up there? That's the default value. Right? I set a default value for this binding. Model binding is going to read the information from the URL and replace this inbound parameter with whatever's on that URL. So we'll put a breakpoint right here. Yeah. And now you can see the fish ID is set to 108, not 107. So you can see it's already reading some information from the URL. And I'll change this to 109 like I did in the last demo. And now I hit enter, and you'll see that this piece of data was populated with that new information. So I didn't have to write any code, right? I'm not writing any code to pull I'm not looking at the query string, I'm not looking at the route data, I'm not looking at the form data. I'm just saying, I know there's some data that could be possibly coming in, and the name of it's going to be fish ID, and would you read it for me and populate this property? Okay. And it also does validation, which is my last demo I have time for today. Peter has a question. How did you get the color tabs in your IDE? I'm using a tool called, it's an extension. I'm using one called, let's see, it's called Productivity Power Tools. This also draws lines between your curly braces. And the way they're color-coded is per project, right? So each project has its own color. Is there a way to present a grid control equivalent in MVC? Not through anything that Microsoft ships. Some of the control vendors are creating grid-like items. Adam says, all major control vendors have released MVC controls. Is this going against the, I can't read the end of that question, the principles of MVC? Well, they're not really controls. They're more like widgets. Basically, they're like HTML helpers that that generate some portion of your, generate some portion of your HTML. So the short answer is no, it doesn't go against the principles, I don't think. Okay, I got time for like a quick demo of validation. All right, so in this validation demo, let me make my start. Okay, I have a class called fish, and inside my fish class, I have some data annotations. So this fish ID is required, and the fish name has a string length of 5 to 128, and this price has a range of 1 cent to $120 if you're doing U.S. currency. So that's inside my fish class. Then over here in my controller, I have split my methods into two. Right. The first time the user goes to the page, they're going to do an HTTP GET. It's going to run this method called editFish. That's going to show the controller. The next time when they enter the fish price and they click on the submit button, that's a postback, right? So I want to route that to a different method. So I say that on the postback, you go to this action. So right, there's two action methods, one called editFish and one called editFishPost. They both share the same name as far as the routing engine is concerned because I specified action name down here to match this one. Right? So the first time it'll go to this one with the GET, the second time it'll go to this one, and I'm using model binding here. You see that? So I'm saying I want the fish class. So it's going to try to populate the properties on this fish class, like the price and the ID from the form. And the form looks like this. Over here in the view, I have an HTML form, and I have an editor for the price, and I have a submit button, and I have a HTML validation message that says validate what's inside the business model and verify whether I've met the business rules. And then you go over to web config, and you make sure that client validation enabled is set to true, and unobtrusive JavaScript enabled is set to true, and then you're good to go. You run the app, edit the fish. I'll type in a value of $45 for this fish, and update. Everything works fine. I try to make it $125, which is over my maximum price. Okay. And the model binding engine read the data, then it went to the validation engine and said, here's, does this meet the validation rules? And the validation rules came back and said, no, it doesn't. So then it output this extra string onto the web, onto the page that's shown to the user. All right, well, I have run out of time. That was a whirlwind tour of what we can do in MVC. I hope you got some useful information out of that. I'd like to thank you for spending an hour and 30 minutes with me. Don't forget that on WinLAC Now, there's a number of ASP.NET MVC courses. I have one on rudiments of routing. That's an hour and 14 minutes of what happens in routing. I also got one on attribute routing there. And I've got, I think, 3 or 4 other ones in MVC. And you get a free trial. If you use RIT-trial, you can try it out for 14 days. And with that, I will turn it back over to Peter. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Walt. There's a lot of MVC stuff around, but there's not very many presentations around that cater for the web forms to MVC crowd. I actually did an article myself on the blog that I do for codeguru.com on the same subject, and I just briefly covered the sort of differences between controls and what have you. Nice. And the comments that it attracted were along the lines of, are you kidding me, or are you stupid? Who on earth would do web forms and not know anything about HTML? And I actually had to put a comment on it. I put a reply on it, and I actually had to put a reply on to the effect of, look, believe you me, there are lots and lots of web forms programmers out there who don't even know what HTML look like. Because the whole idea behind web forms was to mirror WinForms, and many of them just jumped straight into web forms and did everything in the code behind, with the UI being drag and drop. And it took this chap some convincing. You know, he just wasn't buying it. But I do still think, even in this brave new world of MVC, there are a lot of software engineers out there that are stuck maintaining legacy web forms projects. And they really don't know how to get started with MVC.
I agree with that sentiment. And I would counter I get those same comments, and one of the things that I would say is that, you know, there's a whole generation of web developers who grew up doing HTML and CSS and JavaScript and didn't do web forms, right? And so when they come to a web project, they're not assuming that you're going to have this tool that does all that work for you. So when they come to web forms, they're on the opposite side. They're like saying, why would I delegate all the authority of, you know, generating the UI to this Microsoft framework, right? I want more control over my HTML. So for them, the MVC is a great fit, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
You know, but on the other hand, you've got corporate developers, like you said, who have never learned HTML or CSS or JavaScript and don't want to learn it, or whatever. And for the web forms, it's still a viable option. That was one of the points in the beginning of my talk, right? Is that you can still do web forms, and it's still a viable alternative.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I don't know, maybe we need to do some more like this. Oh, hang on. So Bezad's just put one final question in there. How would you do an MVVM pattern to fit in this arena? That's a good question.
Well, so the MVVM pattern, of course, if you're talking about, assuming the XAML one, the VM, the view model in WPF or Silverlight or the other frameworks that use XAML, it leverages a lot of the features that are part of the underlying framework. Like data binding is the number one I can think of right now. And we don't have data binding in the same way in ASP.NET. So that's an issue. Now, having said that, you did see that I did have a view model. So in most of the MVC web frameworks out there, they call a view model the thing that you send, the data transfer object that you send over to the view from the controller.
Of course, there is that as well, and if you don't mind either, Walt, I'd like to add some in there.
Sure.
I myself, I do a lot of MVVM with MVC applications, and the traditional methods that you're used to using client-side, things such as Angular, Knockout.js, Backbone, Spine, all of that lot, all work perfectly well. MVC, because it exposes so much of the HTML, you have as little or as much control of the views as you do of anything else. You know, it's really not an issue if you want to. I mean, I use Knockout pretty much for every project that I do. You know, but that's my chosen way of doing it.
Right. So the point there, though, is that out of the box, the whole view model thing that we're used to in, say, WPF or Silverlight, it doesn't work in MVC unless you use another, like you said, use Knockout.
Oh, no, so absolutely. Yeah, it is a third-party aftermarket thing that you have to add on. It doesn't just do it out of the box. I don't know. I mean, that's not strictly true. You could do it out of the box, but it's going to be a lot harder. Because, I mean, you've got complete control over doing the JavaScript in your views as well. You know, if you were so inclined, you can add a JavaScript of your own creation straight into the editor, typed up in the same manner as you would type a view, and do all your own manipulation of the DOM yourself. But that's basically for masochists, as far as I'm concerned. Knockout, Spine, all that lot just makes it super easy.
And you also use Angular, did you say?
I do, but I don't particularly like it all that much. I'm more of a Knockout man. I do prefer Knockout, especially now with the new Knockout web components. It's nice. That's just come out in version 3.2.0. But on that note, we've hit the 1 hour 30-minute mark. So I'd like to thank you again, Walt. Great presentation. Hopefully the people watching will get some out of it. It will be going onto our YouTube channel. Sorry about the rocky start, but things turned out well in the end, and we got a good session going with some great content. Hopefully you'll come back along again in the future. Don't forget, our links are there, info@lidnug.org, our Twitter, our Facebook, our YouTube. Basically anywhere you see the word LIDNUG or the LIDNUG badge. And again, if it wasn't for our absolutely brilliant sponsors, we wouldn't be able to do what we do. And Wintelect should also be on that slide, as I mentioned at the beginning. Thank you all for coming to watch this presentation tonight. And good night, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world.
Thank you.